Okay, hotter the better. Or barely hotter. Let's get started. Do we have anything that we need to review on these? We feel pretty good here?
Yeah.
Excellent. So we'll just hop into it then. Is that okay?
Yeah.
All righty. So there were a couple of questions. Someone asked me if I could dim the lights so the slides will show up better. I think the issue is that they were too dim. And so that makes the camera bump up the gain, so then when you're looking at something really bright, it just appears totally white. So I'm going to turn them up, not to be a jerk, but to actually try to get some decent contrast on here. Do you get to use notes on the exams and regrades? Yes and yes. So it'll be just like last semester. I don't have a lot of tricks. I do pretty much the same thing every day. Okay, let's hop into it then. We're going to go through development of the nervous system today. The big event that we need to think about, since this is called neurobiology, is neurulation. And that's the creation of the nervous system, where we pull off a big chunk of our skin, essentially, and turn it into nervous tissue. Pretty nifty stuff. We'll talk a bit about how the spinal cord is going to develop, how it knows which part to make motor and which part to make sensory. And then we'll just have a quick glance at our dermatomes. We'll look at innervation of the adult body by our spinal cord. You've had this before, I'm sure. So we'll breeze on through it. So the first event that we're talking about here is the creation of the nervous system, neurulation, where we're going to go from a 3-layered disc into a tube with a tube inside of it and another tube sitting below it. We are just a big tube. That's all we are. We got some limbs, but we're just a tube. That's it. The way that we turn into a tube is through neurulation. So here, if you're following along at home, you can see the formation of this primitive streak. This is what creates our bilateral symmetry. This is gastrulation. This is where we have cells migrating inward to create a 3-layered structure where we have ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm. And now it's folding over to create the neural groove. There's some neural folds on the outside, and here we're going to start to fuse. This will be the neck someday. So we start to pinch together, and we'll see this in cross-section in a little bit. And then we zipper up. Starting in the middle, we'll move anteriorly and posteriorly until we eventually fuse, and we create the typical embryo that every mammal looks like. Whether you're a mouse, a whale, a human, it doesn't matter. We all look like this at some point. We all have a tail. We'll get rid of it, others will keep it. And inside of this embryo, we're going to see our future spinal cord here and our future brain. So here's your neural tube. You can see some bumps. These bumps are going to get a little bit bigger, and they're going to form different parts of our nervous system. Throughout this process, what we're doing is going from a sheet with 3 layers. So here we are early on. And in neurulation, we get this invagination of a part of the ectoderm, the layer cells on the outside, mesoderm's in the middle, and endoderm is going to be most interior there. This invagination occurs here at the midline because of a structure called the notochord, which isn't obvious until a little bit later on, but it's there. This is a part of the mesoderm that's going to guide neurulation. And what it does early on is really 2 things. It acts as an anchor, so it's going to latch onto the ectoderm, so it has a hinge point. This way it can bend there. This part in the midline is securely attached to the mesoderm, and so as we have cell division and migration, the ectoderm expands and forms these little hills here. And that's what creates the neural groove down here, because this middle part is attached to the notochord. So it acts as an anchor. It also acts as a guide. So it spits out little signaling molecules that are going to tell the part of the ectoderm immediately above the notochord to become the nervous tissue. You form the neural tube. All the rest of you, more lateral, you're going to be the skin. But you, right at the midline, you're special. Just like you guys. You're going to form the nervous system. And so throughout neurulation, we continue to grow through cell division. At the neural folds here, the part where it actually folds over, we're going to have fusion. And we're going to separate off from the overlying future epidermis here. So now we have our neural tube here below the notochord. Here you can see actual cross sections. You see that these cartoons are pretty well accurate. This isn't clean, and so right there at the neural folds, as we break off from the rest of the ectoderm, there are some cells called neural crest cells that split off. So these are going to float away and form our sensory nerves and our autonomic ganglia. So those peripheral neurons that don't exist inside the central nervous system. Motor neurons are still going to get made here in the neural tube, but all the neurons that have their cell bodies outside of the brain or spinal cord, those are derived from the neural crest cells. So they're going to contribute to the peripheral nervous system. Once we've separated off, we'll continue to divide. We're going to continue to go through rounds of cell division. That's how we all grow. And that's how our brain is going to grow as well. Early on, we see three primary swellings here. So there's the forebrain, prosencephalon, the midbrain, mesencephalon, and then the rhombencephalon is the hindbrain, blue, purple, green. These two here, the forebrain and hindbrain, are going to continue to divide a little bit further, so we get these 5 primitive swellings a few weeks later. So now we have a telencephalon, which is going to expand dramatically in humans. This is going to create our cerebrum, so that cortex that's far more pronounced in humans than any other animal. This is where the magic happens. This is where we create perceptions and have thoughts and store our memories. That's why we're so smart, because of the continued expansion of the telencephalon. So this is going to outgrow the diencephalon, the other half of the prosencephalon. The diencephalon is just going to form the thalamus. And you'll notice that our midbrain starts to bend. And this is why dorsal and ventral becomes confusing. Our forebrain bends over, and that's why we want to use anterior, posterior, superior, inferior. Because we're going to rotate here on this axis. Not every animal is going to do this, but we do. That hindbrain is going to divide into the future pons and cerebellum. So the metencephalon and then the myelencephalon will be the medulla. These we can further subdivide later on in the class. So we start with 3 swellings. 2 of those are going to divide again, so we get 5 swellings: telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, and myelencephalon. And they'll continue to divide. Notice we don't have any wrinkles here. We're going to create those wrinkles in our cortex through cell division. The progenitor cells that create neurons in glia also act as the road for them. They're what we call radial glia. They get that name because they radiate out away from the ventricular zone, which is exactly what it sounds like. Is that zone or area right around the ventricles. Whether that ventricle be your third ventricle, the spinal canal here, your lateral ventricles, doesn't matter. The area right around the ventricles is going to contain the cell bodies for our neural progenitor cells, or the radial glia. These account for the majority of neurons and glia that are produced in the nervous system. And they're kind of nice because they create an extension from the bottom to the top. So we have a road. So when newborn neurons are created, they can crawl along and settle to create these layers of cortex. The cell division that goes on through development really comes in two types. There's symmetric and asymmetric. And in symmetric cell division, we just clone ourselves. This one cell creates two that's exactly like it. There's no real differentiation here, just growth. We're just expanding in size. The two daughter cells are exactly like the mother. So when we do this, what we're going to do is create two new neural progenitors so we can have a larger nervous system. We're not actually creating nerve cells yet. We create neurons through asymmetric cell division. That has to be true because neurons don't divide. They come from neural progenitor cells, which aren't neurons. If they were neurons, they wouldn't divide. In asymmetric cell division, we create two different cells. And we do that by pushing some proteins over on one side and other proteins over on the other side, and then we split down the middle. So we give one cell one set of instructions, stay a neural progenitor cell, for example, and the other one another set of instructions, go ahead and be a neuron. This asymmetric cell division happens in our radial glia, and then the neurons crawl along those radial glial fibers. So here we're looking at a very stripped away view of the early cortex. So we have our ventricular zone down here, we have the radial glial fiber going on up to the surface, and here's a neuron crawling along the radial glial fiber. Here's a neuron actually crawling on a radial glial fiber. So they just kind of scoot along so they can build one layer at a time. That's cerebral cortex. Now this is of course in a dish, but you get the point. These newborn neurons have the appropriate proteins to stick to that radial glial fiber. So they stay right there in that area and just move on up. And then the next neuron is going to go a little bit beyond them. So we'll build our cortex one layer at a time. At least that's how we make our excitatory neurons. They're made locally. They come off of those radial glial cells and they stay right there. So here's what we just saw. Here's a nice radial glial cell. They're going to go through asymmetric cell division and put the excitatory neurons there one layer at a time. The inhibitory neurons have a slightly longer journey. They come from more ventral regions of the ventricular zone that we call the ganglionic eminences. And we can divide these into a few regions, but we won't. We'll just consider them all the same. These are the source of inhibitory neurons. These don't crawl along radial glial fibers. They have to find their way through long-distance guidance cues and repulsive cues that are going to pull and push them into the appropriate location. So they actually have to migrate around the ventricles and then settle into the cortex. Depending on which genes they express, that'll determine, well, do you stick in the striatum or do you move on up to the cortex? They're going to be attracted to or repulsed by different guidance cues that will allow them to settle in the appropriate locations. It's still asymmetric cell division though, because they're derived from these neural progenitor cells that aren't neurons. And when those neural progenitor cells divide asymmetrically, they produce these future inhibitory neurons, and they crawl their way home. What we end up with is a multi-layered cortex that contains distinct layers of excitatory neurons, and then scattered throughout, we see inhibitory neurons that are there to create logical gates in the cortex so we can have more complex thoughts than just something's touching. Do we have any questions? Okay, well I do, so take a moment, talk about these. Well, let's talk a bit about the spinal cord and how this develops. We got to come back to the notochord. This is still working for us. It's still spitting out diffusible factors that are going to stimulate different developmental pathways. Do you become a motor neuron or a sensory neuron? Well, that depends. Where are you? If you're in more ventral regions or anterior, that works too. If you're in the floor plate, because it's down, it's closer to the floor, you're going to be a motor neuron. And the reason that you're going to be a motor neuron is that you're close to the notochord. And the notochord is going to tell you, be a motor neuron. Early on, all it's saying is, be a nervous system. That's about it. But later on, it refines that message. Be the motor component of the nervous system. And it uses very similar molecules for this, but the future nerve cells just respond a bit differently. This here is not to tell us to be quiet. This is sonic hedgehog. That's the name of this protein here. I know, right? Hedgehog is the family. Yeah, true. It is. Hedgehog is the family of developmental proteins that are going to guide differentiation of cells. And some joker named this one Sonic Hedgehog. What are you going to do? There are others. WIMPs, bone morphogenic proteins. There's a variety of these guidance cues. And we're going to make different ones down below and up top. And so that's going to guide differentiation toward being a motor neuron or being a sensory relay neuron. It just depends. What's your exposure to bone morphogenic protein versus sonic hedgehog? Are you getting about an equal dose of them? Well, you know you're somewhere in the middle, and you're probably just a local circuit interneuron. Nothing wrong with that, but you're not a motor neuron, and you're not a sensory relay. So this is how neurons know where they are. They get these gradients of diffusible proteins that are going to be secreted from more ventral and dorsal regions of the nervous system. And this allows us to create that dorsal ventral axis. There's the same thing going on for the anterior and posterior axis. How does the part of the neural tube that's going to be the brain know to be the brain and not a part of the spinal cord? Well, it has to do with diffusible factors that tell it you're in the front, so you be the brain. We won't get into those. We can if you'd like. Come on by my office. But the notochord still works throughout development to help establish that dorsal ventral axis. Once we make our spinal cord, they're all going to look pretty similar. We're going to have our gray matter in the center here. So here we'll have our motor neurons, sensory relays. The sensory neurons themselves are going to live out in the dorsal root ganglia. And the sensory and motor fibers are going to exit out through that intervertebral foramen. We'll have our dura, arachnoid, and pia maters. Those are still there. And we also have, of course, vasculature to keep our nervous tissue well perfused. Just like everywhere else in the nervous system, there's no valves here. That's great because it keeps pressure low. We have low pressure drainage, low resistance drainage. But we also don't have any barrier against cell migration. So this is a very common place for cancer cells to migrate through. That's one of the cons. Everything has pros and cons. Now, when we're building this spinal cord over time, we don't build it at the same rate that we're building our vertebra. We're going to have rapid expansion of that vertebral column, around 12 weeks or so. Before then, spinal cord and the vertebra match up pretty well. But throughout development, the vertebra grow more rapidly than the spinal cord. This will eventually stop. And then at birth, the end of the spinal cord is actually around L2, somewhere in that region. So it's still up in the lumbar spine, even though it's still going to project nerve roots down through the lower lumbar and sacral regions of the spinal cord. It's of course going to be anchored in place. So this is still attached to the end of the vertebral column. Here's the spinal terminality. This is just a bit of connective tissue that holds the spinal cord in place. But we have this nice cistern down here, the lumbar cistern, that's just filled with CSF and a bunch of nerve fibers that we call the cauda equina, the horse's tail. Kind of what it looks like. So here it is. Here's the end of the spinal cord itself, but we're still projecting nerve fibers downward so that we can create the lower lumbar and sacral nerve roots. But because we don't have spinal cord here and we're largely not innervating the dura mater, this is an excellent place to access CSF. you don't run the risk of bumping into the spinal cord. Neurons in the central nervous system won't regenerate. So we don't want to puncture up here if we can avoid it. Down here is great. No innervation, no spinal column. Or sorry, no spinal cord. Now when we're building our vertebra, this is going to require the fusion of a few different bony structures so we create a vertebra. And normally this happens without error, so these neural arches are going to fuse and form the vertebral arch in the more posterior regions. Up front, we have that centrum here, and so these are going to contribute to your vertebra. When they don't fuse, we get spina bifida there. This can be benign. We have very low risk of injury, where we just don't have fusion of the bone, but the nervous system is fine. Neurulation went well. It's not protruding. Spina bifida occulta here. A surprisingly high number of people are estimated to have this because you don't have symptoms. You're not going to see much there except for maybe a little hair. When we start to have protrusion of either the meninges, that's what we see in meningeal, we create what we call a cyst. That meninges, that could just be your meninges, or it could also include nervous tissue. That's what these orange dots are telling you. That's your nervous tissue, and that's what that myelo is about. This is nervous tissue, and meninges are protruding outside. This exposes them to potential injury. It's far more serious when we have issues with neurulation, and that's what we see in myelosteel. So we actually have exposed neural plate. It didn't fuse. It didn't fold over and separate from the rest of the skin, so you see exposed nervous tissue, CSF leaks out. This is an emergency. Must be treated immediately. This is a life-threatening complication. Most likely, the child will survive but have some sensory motor dysfunction as a result of damaged nervous tissue. Neurons don't like to be exposed to air. They're very, very delicate. You can find pictures of this. I'm not going to show them to you, just in case you're not into that. I don't want to force that on you. But you should get used to that a little bit. You don't want to pass out when you see injuries. That happens. Doesn't look good. Do we have any questions? We're getting this is going from benign to could kill you if left untreated. So we're increasing in severity here. As long as you get that, we're pretty good. All right. Let's see if we can answer these, and we'll hit the last main point. We'll run through our dermatomes a little bit, and then we'll call it class. So you've seen these before. Depending on the location in the spinal cord, that's going to correspond to your location in the body that you're innervating. Either you're providing motor output to the musculature in that general region, or you're receiving sensory input from that region. It's a little cleaner for the dermatomes in terms of this superior to inferior divisions, where cervical regions serve higher portions of the body, and the lower, more sacral portions are going to serve lower portions of the body. It kind of wraps around and comes back up to serve the genitals and butt near the most sacral regions. So you can see these dermatomes here, and I hope they can in the recording as well. You can also see them in cases of shingles. So here we have probably around a T5 infection here. What we're looking at are just blisters that form because of reactivation of the virus. So viral infection of sensory neurons is going to lead to shingles. This virus will lay dormant in the dorsal root ganglia until there's some stressor, whether that be illness, actual stress, or aging. That's not easy either. That can reactivate the virus. And you'll get these outbreaks here, just along that dermatome. There's a little spreading back and forth because these dermatomes aren't as clean as this cartoon suggests. There's a little overlap for good reason. Why does that make sense that we have overlap in our dermatomes? So what do you mean by that?
Injury or something happens to go on.
Yeah. We always have to account for injury. That's always a possibility. And so if you have no overlap at all, then you'll have a band of skin that has absolutely no sensation. Because we have some overlap, there's a much smaller area where we lose sensation if we have damage to that nerve root, for example. So you always want some overlap. That's the logic of the nervous system. Make too much. Create an excess so that when times get tough, we're okay. We got it covered. Now, the innervation by the motor neurons is slightly more complicated because of this overlap. Multiple nerves can hit a muscle. One nerve can hit more than one muscle, at least when we're talking about roots. So it's not as clean of a division as the dermatomes. One nerve root can act on multiple joints, but there's this general division where cervical regions serve higher and the lumbar regions serve lower. So that makes good sense. The devil's in the details here. Which peripheral nerve are we talking about? That's when it starts to make more sense. But I'm not going to talk about that. You guys are going to talk about that later on. But these different nerve roots are going to intermix to create our different peripheral nerves that then innervate more specific targets. And then it makes a bit more sense when you think about these movements. I don't want to spoil it, it's in your thunder. Now, injury can happen. We need a fail-safe. Injury is always an option, especially for the peripheral nervous system. It's exposed to the real world. These nerves have to pass through fine openings, like the intervertebral foramen here, or maybe out there in your carpal tunnel. And those are sites where we can have compression. That compression can happen on peripheral nerves. It can happen to spinal roots, which is what we're seeing here. If there's inflammation, if there's autoimmune targeting of the bone that then leads to swelling, if there's just bony outgrowth, if there's tumor growth, there are many ways to compress this little tiny space and damage the nerve. We can also have slippage of our discs. That can then stimulate meningeal branches of these peripheral nerves, which we don't see here or in many of the cartoons. But there's a little offshoot that comes back here and innervates the ligaments between the vertebrae. And so when those get inflamed or compressed, we get back pain. Those meningeal offshoots create pain. They're little tiny fibers. And inflammation, of course, creates pain because the pain-sensing fibers are tuned to the pro-inflammatory cytokines and the acidification that occurs. And when we have compression, the same thing happens that happened last semester. First, you're going to have loss of the myelinating glia. That's not so bad because glia can divide, they can create more of themselves, they'll regrow. We might have loss of axons. That's a little worse. If we have continued compression, well, we can have loss of the neuron, and that's when things get bad. What you'll see, pain is always an option. Of course, anytime there's injury, there's going to be pain. Anytime there's inflammation, there's going to be pain. If you've ever had the flu or any systemic inflammation throughout your body, everything just kind of hurts. Pain's always an option. As we have loss of myelin, we can start to see sensory and motor dysfunction. So, of course, there could be pain because of inflammation. You could also have weakness, some temporary paralysis, for example. That could occur in more extreme cases. But you can get motor symptoms like weakness. You can have sensory symptoms. When there isn't proper input, we might feel some numbness because we can't actually sense what's going on in that region of our body anymore. You might feel a little bit of tingling. So there could be motor problems, there could be sensory problems. When we have compression at the root, we should expect both, for sure. When we have damage to the spinal cord, then we can start to distinguish those. But any peripheral damage is likely to include both elements because these fibers are intermixed once we exit the spinal cord. So you shouldn't expect to see only weakness without any sort of sensory disturbance if you have peripheral nerve damage. That can only occur because of central damage. That's where we pull these two apart and separate motor into the ventral regions and sensory into the dorsal, and we keep them separate as they move on up to the cortex. So it's possible to tease those apart. Out there in the periphery, impossible. You're going to see motor and sensory disturbances. Okay. Any questions? Okay, good. We're going to have to hurry so I don't have another problem. All right. Let's talk about these and then that's it.